World War II and brought immediate consequences, not just for the combatants but for the colossal infrastructure built to wage it. With the surrender of Japan in August 1945, the Imperial Navy's formidable fleet had already been decimated in both its numbers and its ability to carry out offensive operations. However, while the battleships, aircraft carriers, and submarines were either sunk, scrapped, or repurposed, a different kind of legacy remained: the massive submarine pens. Designed to shelter Japan's fleet of submarines, these structures represented the peak of wartime naval engineering. Now, in the wake of surrender, their future was uncertain, but their sheer scale demanded attention. At the conclusion of hostilities, Japan faced immediate economic and logistical challenges. The war had drained the country's resources, and with the sudden cessation of fighting, the focus shifted to reconstruction. Yet, the costs of maintaining a military presence were high, and the Navy, once a critical instrument of imperial dominance, was now an obsolete force under the conditions of post-war disarmament. The nation's limited industrial capacity could not sustain the lavish infrastructure built during wartime, especially when that infrastructure was designed to support a military that no longer existed in the same form. The submarine pens were among the largest and most expensive remnants of this bygone era. These massive concrete structures, often built into cliffs or coastal fortifications, were designed to protect the most advanced submarines of the Imperial Navy from Allied bombings. Located along Japan's Pacific coastline, they included facilities at major naval bases like Kure, Sasebo, and Yokosuka, with some of the most impressive sites situated on the southern islands of Kyushu and Shikoku. The total number of submarine pens built across Japan by the war's end is estimated at over 30, each requiring significant labor, resources, and time to construct. In the context of a war economy, these were investments designed for long-term use, anticipating Japan's continued naval supremacy. By 1946, however, with the disarmament directives under the auspices of the Allied occupation forces led by General Douglas MacArthur, Japan was prohibited from maintaining any significant naval fleet. The focus shifted to rebuilding the country's civilian infrastructure, while military assets, particularly those connected to the Imperial Navy, became a heavy burden. The immediate directive was to dismantle military installations, and this included the submarine pens. Yet the scale and nature of these structures made their fate more complicated than simple demolition. Despite the pressing need to dismantle military installations, the immense size and fortifications of the submarine pens made their destruction not an easy task. Some pens had walls up to 40 feet thick, constructed of reinforced concrete designed to withstand the heaviest aerial bombardments. These facilities were not easily torn down or abandoned. It was a logistical nightmare. The problem was exacerbated by Japan's fragile post-war economy, which was struggling to meet the needs of its people. With limited resources available, the decision-making process was slow and deliberate. In some cases, the immediate post-war years saw a shift in the pen's usage. They became sites for repurposing rather than demolition, if only temporarily. In the southwestern regions, where Allied forces had not been able to strike as effectively, the pens found a new lease on life in a different, civilian capacity. Some were converted into storage facilities or even used for industrial purposes in the early years of reconstruction. The industrialization of Japan's recovery, driven by external support from the U.S., meant that these former military structures could play a role in restarting civilian production. For instance, the Yokosuka submarine pen, once a fortress for military vessels, was turned into a storage and manufacturing site in the immediate post-war years. It wasn't much of a stretch. After all, Japan's industrial capabilities had been shaped by its wartime economy, and the transition to peacetime industrialization could exploit some of the leftover infrastructure. However, these temporary uses could not mask the growing pressure to dismantle the more extreme remnants of military architecture. Japan's growing need for capital and materials meant that these structures were viewed with increasing suspicion by the occupying forces. As part of the broader denazification and demilitarization policy, the Allied occupation's instructions included the elimination of all military fortifications. The problem was that this was not merely about tearing down structures. It was about managing the aftermath of wartime construction on a scale rarely seen. The logistical and financial burden of dismantling these structures became apparent when the costs were calculated. In some cases, Japanese officials pushed back on full demolition, given the lack of available manpower and resources. Moreover, the vast concrete bunkers had been designed with such attention to durability that even with modern equipment, the task of breaking them down was daunting. The choice was clear: some would have to be left intact for the foreseeable future, as the financial strain of total demolition proved too much to bear in the immediate post-war environment. Japan's post-war industrial landscape, focused on rebuilding civilian factories and infrastructure, could not accommodate the sudden removal of such massive structures. In some regions, the pens became part of the urban landscape, sitting idly as relics of a military past. The loss of military control, compounded by the occupation and growing discontent over the lack of resources, meant that Japan's approach to the fate of the submarine pens was both strategic and reactive. In many places, particularly in the southern and western regions of the country, the government simply had no choice but to leave them abandoned. The question of what to do with the pens became even more pressing as the years went by. By the early 1950s, as Japan began its recovery under the guidance of the U.S., and the signing of the San Francisco Peace Treaty in 1951, the fate of these structures remained uncertain. Many of the pens remained forgotten, overshadowed by the rebuilding of the nation's industrial core, its roads, and its homes. Others, in more practical terms, were seen as obstacles to post-war growth. At this stage, it became clear that the full scope of the loss would not be known for some time. Some submarine pens would be preserved as historical curiosities, monuments to a past that had been effectively erased in the name of peace. Others were left to decay, slowly reclaimed by nature, their massive concrete walls now standing as silent sentinels to a time long gone. With the economic pressures of post-war reconstruction and the immediate focus on the civilian economy, the remnants of Japan's wartime military infrastructure became casualties of history, reduced, repurposed, or abandoned, their once mighty purpose now forgotten by the generations that rebuilt the country. By the mid-1950s, the overwhelming economic pressures Japan faced meant that the fate of its war-era military infrastructure was no longer a pressing concern for the newly restored government. Rebuilding the nation's civilian economy became the priority. As a result, many of the submarine pens, those enormous fortifications meant to shelter Japan's submarines from Allied bombing raids, began to fade into obsolescence, their significance lost in the surge of post-war industrial development. However, as Japan rebuilt, there remained an undercurrent of uncertainty about what to do with these massive remnants of military history. The pressing question in the early 1950s was whether to fully dismantle these structures or leave them as silent witnesses to a past long gone. The post-war occupation and subsequent military demilitarization were followed by the ratification of the San Francisco Peace Treaty in 1951, which formally ended the war and the military restrictions on Japan. Yet, despite the clear shift from military to civilian priorities, the legacy of Japan's war machinery remained rooted in the landscape. Submarine pens, far from being completely erased from the historical record, lingered as cumbersome reminders of the empire's naval ambitions. By the time the occupation officially ended in 1952, Japan was still struggling with the economic burden of their existence. The solution was neither simple nor immediate. While the submarine pens themselves were not immediately destroyed, their potential use in the rebuilding effort grew less likely. With the nation's infrastructure needing urgent repairs, it became apparent that repurposing these mammoth structures was impractical in most cases. Moreover, with the growing industrialization efforts to rebuild Japan's civilian economy under the guidance of U.S. advisors, the war remnants were seen as unnecessary baggage. The logistical cost of demolishing or reusing these massive fortifications was simply too high for a country still recovering from the devastation of war. Some pens, however, were indeed put to use, albeit temporarily. In the early years of recovery, certain structures were employed as storage facilities, primarily for industrial goods and supplies. These conversions allowed for a limited but functional reallocation of space, even though the original purpose of the pens, designed to house the Imperial Navy's fleet, was entirely unrelated to civilian needs. The massive size of these structures made them suitable for temporary uses, but such adaptations were not enough to offer them long-term utility in a post-war economy oriented around peace and recovery. By the time the 1960s arrived, the economic landscape of Japan had transformed. The country's industrial base had expanded rapidly, with heavy industries such as steel, automobile manufacturing, and electronics taking precedence. The construction of new factories and infrastructure demanded space, but not the cavernous, reinforced concrete pens left over from a bygone military era. As Japan entered its period of high economic growth, much of the unused wartime infrastructure was abandoned, and the former submarine pens became increasingly neglected. Their sheer size and robust construction meant that, while they were no longer of any immediate use, they were also too difficult to dismantle. In some instances, the Japanese government's attention turned to the feasibility of repurposing these structures in more radical ways. For instance, some were considered as sites for large-scale public works or housing projects, but again, the financial and logistical barriers proved too significant. The technology and manpower required to modify such heavy-duty fortifications were beyond the scope of what Japan could reasonably undertake. Instead, many pens stood untouched for years, decaying slowly in their coastal locations and offering little more than a stark reminder of the empire's former military might. While the majority of these pens were left to their eventual fate, a few became the subject of limited preservation efforts, though this was hardly a widespread trend. The importance of historical preservation did not fully take root in Japan until the 1970s, and even then, the concept of preserving war-related structures was still highly contentious. The historical significance of the submarine pens was not yet widely recognized, and their monumental size and military associations left little room for romanticized views of the past. These pens, now desolate and forgotten by most, became the ultimate symbols of a conflict long since ended. Yet, in certain quarters, particularly among local communities, there were sporadic efforts to salvage these remnants of the wartime past. Some individuals and groups began to see the historical value of preserving certain pens, not as relics of military power but as part of the larger narrative of Japan's experience during the war. This view remained, however, on the margins of mainstream historical memory. In the 1980s and 1990s, as part of a broader historical reevaluation in Japan, there were isolated efforts to preserve certain aspects of the wartime landscape, including some of the submarine pens. These initiatives were often driven by local historians, preservationists, and community members who understood the importance of preserving the material remnants of the past, even if those remnants were controversial. Yet these attempts were few and far between. For the most part, Japan's focus remained on its post-war economic success, and the wartime remnants, particularly the submarine pens, faded further into obscurity. Meanwhile, in more rural regions where the infrastructure of modern Japan had yet to take hold, some pens were simply abandoned and left to deteriorate. The harsh coastal weather, combined with years of neglect, took its toll on these massive concrete structures. Saltwater, wind, and the gradual encroachment of nature began to erode the once mighty fortifications. Nature, in a sense, became an unintended agent of destruction, slowly reclaiming what had once been a symbol of imperial ambition. Over time, these decaying structures became part of the local scenery, their historical significance overlooked by most, save for those who remembered them from their wartime purpose. By the early 2000s, some pens had been demolished in various phases. Local governments and private organizations made the decision to remove certain structures that stood in the way of development. In some cases, this demolition was motivated by the need for land to accommodate new housing, commercial developments, or infrastructure projects. The financial costs of keeping these monumental structures intact, given their disrepair and the growing need for usable space, eventually outweighed any potential historical value they might have had. The fate of the submarine pens was ultimately one of gradual erosion, both physically and culturally. As Japan's focus shifted away from its wartime past, the monumental structures became increasingly irrelevant to the nation's evolving identity. By the early 21st century, many had disappeared entirely, buried under layers of construction, or simply left to decay into the landscape. Others, however, have remained as a somber reminder of Japan's naval ambition during the height of its imperial power, standing in quiet defiance of the forces of time and history. Today, a few of the more well-preserved submarine pens are accessible to the public, often in the form of museums or historical sites. These remaining structures, though much fewer in number, serve as poignant remnants of a past that was slowly buried by the overwhelming tides of post-war recovery and modernization. In their enduring silence, they embody the complex and often painful legacy of the war, a past that Japan as a nation has sought to move beyond, even as the physical structures that once held such military significance quietly endure. The fate of the Japanese submarine pens, once symbols of war and dominance, now serves as a powerful illustration of how societies deal with the aftermath of conflict. The remnants of a war-driven past are not always easily erased, even when the society that created them seeks to leave them behind. What remains, in the end, is not just the concrete and steel of forgotten fortifications, but the lessons of how history is made, and sometimes how it is left to slowly disappear from memory.